Hi everyone, LJ Anderson here. Today we're going to be doing a book review of Salvation by Allegiance Alone, Rethinking Faith, Works, and the Gospel of Jesus the King by Matthew Bates. If you're just finding this video randomly or you're a subscriber to the channel, odds are actually pretty good that you've never heard of this book. Maybe you never heard of this person. Matthew Bates is a professor at Notre Dame? No. PhD from Notre Dame, but he is a professor at Quincy University. And as you may have guessed, this book is quite scholarly, and if you if you're not in the academic world, one of the things that I would caution you on is that this is an academic book. It doesn't really pull any punches as far as like you're expected to know things, and it's not the easiest read in the world. It's designed to be a scholarly work, not something that's read at the popular level. So for me, I enjoyed this book. I think it's a great book. And we'll get into more of what the book is. We'll get into more of what the book is in a second. But I found this book to be very interesting. I actually have been working on a book in a very similar vein as this book. That I am basically at the editing stage now, and hopefully that book will release here. Probably this summer. I'll have to figure out exactly when that's going to happen. A lot of it's going to depend on my PhD, which starts on Monday. So when this video comes out, I will have been in my PhD for a while. But as of recording this, my PhD starts in 2 days. So Sunday and then Monday is when I start. So wish me luck on that. Pray for me. I could use it. I'm beginning a long journey. I anticipate being quite busy. That said, this book is refreshing in the sense that the title tells you exactly what the book is about. It's one of the things I really like about scholarly works. I have my own books do this as well. I try to walk the line between scholarly and accessible to your average believer. I don't like having books that are only for people who are professional theologians. I think we should all Christians should be able to read the books that I have. A brand new believer probably is going to struggle, but somebody who has been a Christian, an actively participating Christian for a few years should be able to pick up a book that I write and be able to follow along to some extent. At least that's the hope. This is not one of those books. If you've been a Christian for a long time, or if you've done any Bible college or seminary, you probably will be able to read this just fine. But that was kind of a rabbit trail. This book tells you what it's all about. Salvation by allegiance alone, and you might be going, wait, I thought it was salvation by faith alone. Well, that's what this entire book is about. It is trying to prove that allegiance is a much better way of talking about faith, as the Bible demonstrates it, than our idea of faith. So we have this idea of faith of, kind of this blind, blind trust that has no strings attached to it. I guess is the way I'm looking to phrase that. That you and I are saved simply by believing in Jesus, and that's it. End of story. This is kind of, arguing against that. Well, I mean, that is arguing against that. He's basically saying, salvation is by devotion to a king, to a Lord. And, Jesus is that king, and that involves, belief in him, but it also involves a life of, the words that he uses are allegiance or fidelity, but also you could use devotion. And, essentially his argument is that we should typically translate faith as allegiance or fidelity to, understand what he's saying. And, he makes a good case. I think that there are things that he doesn't do well. We'll get into that a little bit later, but I do think that this is a good book for you to read if you feel like you can take on the challenge. It's not the most dense book I've ever read. It's not at that level, but it's not, an easy read. But it's a good conversation to have, if you think of it as a conversation, he's trying to talk to you. And, as a reader, especially of books like this, we should be engaging with it, with our minds, write down stuff, look up scripture. Does it align with scripture? Can we, can we agree with what he's saying? And in this case, I would say that there's definitely a lot of truth that he's talking about, but there are things that he takes too far. But one of the things that he does really well is he weaves scripture into his writing. So, he'll have paragraphs where he's, writing, and then, there's a scripture quote as he's writing, and he keeps going, a scripture quote, and he keeps going in the scripture quote. And it's actually a really, it doesn't, jar you to see that quote. Sometimes we have that effect when we write, and we're like, all right, well, here we go. Oh, and here is the scripture on this, and it says this. The way that he's doing this in many cases is like, well, there's quote marks, and he's got the reference, the location for the scripture, but it flows with the paragraph, and it's really a nice way of doing that. I appreciate the way that he has, woven scripture into the very fabric of a lot of his paragraphs. That said, I do want to get into some of the areas that are a little bit iffy. In my opinion, I do think that there are some areas. First off, so he is a professor at a, I believe it's a Catholic school. I think Quincy University is a Catholic school. And he's a Protestant. So he's a Protestant professor who works in a Catholic school. And there was one example that I was like, he's really treading carefully, making sure that he's not condemning any faith groups that are not, your traditional Protestant faith. And in particular, this was on the Mormons. And, it's not the topic today, so I'm not going to get into it much, but the Mormon faith is very different from the Christian faith. Even though we sound very similar, there's a lot of differences, and it's, a Christian Protestant should be willing to stand against that. By page, I think it's 17, he's demonstrating that he's unwilling to condemn a faith group, which makes sense because I'm sure that he is concerned that he might get, kicked out of his position, because he is a Protestant, not at a Protestant school. That's something to be aware of. This book is kind of an attack on Protestants in the sense of, he's saying, well, our view of faith, basically since the Reformation, is twisted a little bit, and what the Bible is actually saying is allegiance or fidelity, and that we need to get to that. Well, that's essentially what the Greek Orthodox believe, and it's similar-ish to what the Catholics believe. Ultimately, he just seems a little bit hesitant to, condemn any different group, Christian group. So that's one area, fairly minor in the grand scheme of things. But the other area is, a little more major in the sense that I think it really digs, a hole in his argument. And that is that we have biblical evidence that quite clearly argues that, pistis, which is faith, typically translated as faith, does not fit with his definition. So he, kind of makes the argument that he would prefer that when we translate pistis, we are saying, we're translating it to allegiance or fidelity most of the time. But, James is a book of the Bible that kind of, throws that out as an option. So James talks about faith and works in a way that, they're separate but connected. They're not the same idea, but when they come together, they make a complete something. So, James's argument is faith alone is worthless. Faith plus works, we need to have works, and if we don't have works, we have a dead faith. That's James's argument, and that idea of faith that James puts forth is the same as, what we would say faith is today, is that it's a belief thing. But that, kind of goes directly against what Bates is saying in here. And so I would be hesitant to, accept that idea from his book. That said, I do agree that allegiance is a better term in general. I just don't think that we should translate faith to be allegiance unless there's, internal evidence to suggest that that's what we should be reading. So, for example, when Paul says salvation is by grace through faith, might be justification, and not by works, he is talking about, faith in the sense of it is something we believe, and it has nothing to do with our works. We're not earning our salvation. We are believing in Jesus and, devoting ourselves to him. But it's not like Paul is contrasting the faith and the works here. Whereas James was saying, well, you have both of them together and they complete each other, actually. So faith begins the justification process, works completes it. That's how it works. I argue, so in the book that I'm working on, that is finished but needs to be edited, I argue from a different angle than what he is in his book. So I don't try to argue that we should retranslate faith or anything like that. I just argue from the idea that there are tons of verses that talk about our works and what we must do. And the Bible demonstrates that devotion to Jesus is a requirement. Therefore, we need to treat it as such. that's something I don't really want to get into a whole lot. I have written an entire book on this, and that's way too involved for this video. So when that comes out, I would much prefer that people read the book and, engage with my full thought than just engage with me here. I am all for engaging with this, but fitting an entire book into this video is not something I intend to try to do. So there's that. All that to say, I think there's a lot of good things that can come from reading this book. Read it while being very, skeptical in a sense. That we should, any book that we read that's not the Bible, we should come at it with this author probably doesn't get everything right, and we need to make sure that we are finding those things or doing our best to find those things so that we don't start believing something that's false, and hold to the good and get rid of what's bad. So this is a book that I think is an excellent read in the sense that there's a lot of good things that we can learn from it and that we need to really engage with today. We live in a culture that, even a Christian culture is kind of what I'm getting at, is where there's this idea that I believe in Jesus, therefore I'm good. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to devote my life to Jesus. I just need to, show up on Sunday, and that's it. And that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible is very clear that we are to follow Jesus. We are not just to believe in him, and somehow that saves us on its own. That is the start, and it is completed with the devotion. All that's to say, I would recommend reading this book, even though I do believe that there are some things that are, a little iffy in it. But it is a good conversation starter. Read it, talk about with others with it. If you got some friends, read it together. And then you can bounce ideas off of each other and go that route. Anyway, that's all I have for you for this book review. I will be back with more. Thank you for watching. And if you like this video, please like it and subscribe. And until next time, God bless.